Thank you, Gertrude, and thank for everybody for being here. It's really a great turnout. I'm very privileged to be able to speak today. I hope I'm going to keep to the time. We'll see. I tend to stick to a script because if I don't, I'll be here for the next hour and a half, and you'll be really leaving before me. Before I start, I really want to talk just a little bit about the sources. I don't really talk about that in here, but I will refer to them. Most of this work is based on research that I've been doing over the years, and the larger part of the talk will be based on letters, diaries, and recorded interviews with the voluntary nurses that I've studied. Now, these weren't recorded by me. These were done mostly in the 1970s. There's one that was done in the 90s. These women were mostly born roughly in the 1890s, so obviously they are unfortunately not with us anymore. But I will refer back and forth to these, and of course a few institutional sources as well. And also, I should clarify that most of this talk will be from the perspective of the voluntary nurses, their responses, their impressions of the nurses they worked with, because I haven't been studying this from nurses themselves, the registered nurses, but from the voluntary women. But, I do wish I could do both, but there's masses of stuff out there. I will start by really sort of giving a bit of background and what my rationale is for this discussion. I'll talk a little bit about the training, but I'm of the VADs, so that you can get some perception of the differences between qualified nurses in the First War era and voluntary nurses. It can get a little dry, so I cut a lot of that off, but if anybody has questions about that later, I'm happy to fill you in. And then I'll move on to talking about the voluntary nurses working with the Canadian nurses in the local military convalescent hospitals here in Canada, and then the smaller group who went overseas. Some worked just in England, some worked overseas in France, a few in Belgium. France is the larger area. The differences there, though, is that the women who went overseas were working with British nurses, not with Canadian military nurses, and I do make that point. They were not welcome in the Canadian Army Medical Corps hospitals at the time. So it's a really sort of perspective of working with Canadians in Canada, but working with British nurses overseas. And there are some differences there as well. So I'll get started without any more preambles. As of Armistice Day in 1918, an estimated 2,000 Canadian and Newfoundland women had enlisted as members of a voluntary aid society. And that number keeps going up because people keep telling me about more. Now, hopefully, this is the Ottawa group at the time. Now, of these, there were some 500 who saw active service overseas. They were primarily nursing assistants in the British military hospitals. The majority remained here at home, so 1,500 roughly, not all working at the same time, providing full and part-time nursing assistance in the military convalescent hospitals across Canada and Newfoundland. And I will include Newfoundland as a separate category because at the time, of course, it was the Dominion of Newfoundland. But interestingly, when they both went overseas, they were all classified as colonials because they were from the colonial areas of the empire at the time. Now, over the century since the start of the war, the role and identity of these women has really been overshadowed by the legacy of England's most well-known VAD, and most of you may have heard of her, Vera Brittain. A beautiful young woman, very young at the time. She was well-bred, not aristocratic, but close, came from a very privileged background. She had very scant experience of the working world, but it's really colored the perception of all VAD workers, in particular the Canadian workers, regardless of their origins. In reality, the Canadian and Newfoundland women present a more varied profile than their British sisters. They were far less elite. There were some who were very upper middle class, but they were far less elite and aristocratic and much more diverse in their background and experience. A lot of them had experience in the working world as teachers, clerical workers, many other areas of work, white-collar work for women at that time. Now, in the British military hospitals, the VADs from Canada and Newfoundland, as I said, were often characterized as colonials. And Although all VAD nurses perform much the same work overseas, the experience of a colonial VAD with that identification was often framed by this identity, an alien identity that set her apart. At home in Canada, this wasn't a problem, of course, but any misgivings about the VADs working in Canadian military hospitals really rested firmly on their status as unqualified nurses. This objection was dismissed in the local Canadian military convalescent hospitals after a time because it was expedient. They were available in abundance, great abundance, when the qualified nursing reserves were being depleted. They were cost-free, which was a great advantage, and unlike the orderlies, the male orderlies, they weren't wanted for service overseas, so they were there. So gradually the idea sort of slipped in that they could do the job of nursing assistants if necessary. Now, none of these arguments impressed the Canadian Army Medical Corps Nursing Service. Their matron-in-chief, Margaret MacDonald, and firmly excluded the VADs from the CAMC hospitals overseas. She argued that unqualified women would undermine the military hospital efficiency and the authority of the qualified nursing personnel. And she was able to stick to that throughout the war. With the war offering nurses themselves an opportunity to showcase their knowledge and skills on the international stage, the civilian nursing establishment fully endorsed MacDonald's policy. And in their military-style uniforms, and this is the dress uniform that the VADs were wearing, they were easily confused with the regular military nurses. It was very similar, and I will show you a picture in just a second, by patients and the general public alike. Now, many of you have seen this picture before. It's very familiar. This is the nurses leaving Victoria. But they're not identical, but it's really, really close. The only difference, the Canadians wore gray. They didn't wear blue. Civilian nursing leaders were also very worried that as unqualified women, the VADs could jeopardize nursing's aspirations for professional status, which was ongoing and was hoped to increase after the war. Now, the British nurses were echoing these concerns. That was still a problem for them, but there was a much more pressure on them to have more available staff overseas. And it was difficult to get reliable nursing assistants in their own hospitals. And so they countered their sort of problems with this by saying, okay, we will take on the VADs, but we're going to help them and we're going to help train them. It was a different attitude towards it, but it was expedient at the time. This paper explores the boundaries that define the VAD's place at the bedside and the contested space of the wartime military hospitals in Canada and overseas in the British hospitals. So I'm going to look at how they worked together. I'm going to focus on the underlying challenges that the VADs presented to the authority of the nursing professionals and how these affected their working relations on a day-to-day basis. Despite their sometimes uneasy relationship, it can really be argued that the nurses and the VADs achieved a common ground in striving for the best possible outcome for their patients. But rather than the elite Vera Brittain image of the ideal VAD, the colonial model more closely resembled the average English-Canadian nursing probationer of the era. They were aged primarily from mid-20s to early 30s. They were unmarried. They were necessarily white. They were Anglophone. They were Protestant. There was no restriction. There was no restriction on being Catholic. And I think I've even got one or two who might have been Jewish. I'm not sure. But certainly they had to be white. And they had to be educated, at least a high school education. But there were several who had gone on to university. And they were, of course, always eminently respectable young women, as this lovely group from Calgary. Interesting, in that particular picture, you can see the prominent Red Cross on the bib. That was not the uniform of the St. John Ambulance. St. John Ambulance had the black armband with their symbol. You can see that on their sleeves. But in order to kind of fit in with the idea of the wartime nurse, they adopted the Red Cross that the British VADs wore on their uniform, and nobody really objected. They just, so long as they did the job, that was fine. In mid-1918, the director of the St. John Ambulance VAD program, Dr. Charles Kopp, addressed a nursing audience. He emphasized that VADs were recruited only from the best homes, stressing their suitability to work alongside the nurses. He also assured the nurses that the VAD service was a temporary patriotic undertaking. The VADs were forbidden to circumvent the 3-year training program, take up permanent paid nursing work in the post-war, although he did have this sort of cautionary note that he couldn't guarantee that once retired and out of St. John control, a VAD would not follow that course. Interestingly, very few did. In 1914, the Canadian National Association of Trained Nurses had dismissed the VAD movement as a very small, inconsequential organization, posing absolutely no challenge to the qualified nursing community. That's when they were just 200 or 300. By mid-1918, enrollment was nearing 2,000, and the nurses' confidence in this was far less secure. So, training them. Under the Wartime Emergency Relief Committee, the St. John Ambulance developed the VAD program to shore up the domestic military medical services in case of invasion, and that was really their rationale from the start. Should Canada be invaded, we would have extra personnel to help. These fears, of course, very quickly subsided, and the military convalescent facilities rapidly began to spring up across Canada, certainly by April 1915, after the first gas attack. Their constantly growing need for nursing personnel meant that well-trained nursing assistants were much in demand, and unwaged VADs emerged as a very welcome option with the increasing costs of the war. Now, once this initial resistance to volunteer nurses in the local hospitals was overcome, the VADs were familiar figures in towns and cities across Canada. And at the heart of this resistance was the issue of their training. How could VADs, with their brief classroom training, be expected to take on the duties and responsibilities of even a neophyte nursing probationer? The VAD training program had been adapted from the Red Cross Home Nursing Manual that had been used in Britain. It was developed just before the war. And in content and organization, it closely paralleled contemporary nursing texts. And I did compare them. I looked at both. And if you look chapter by chapter, they're very similar. This is just a page from the manual itself. This one is to do with learning to feed a patient in bed. There's lots and lots of things on bandaging, masses of it. A second St. John Ambulance course in first aid was also required, the same one that the men took when they were learning to be ambulance men for St. John. Then it covered basic emergency treatments, fractures, hemorrhaging, poisoning, that sort of thing. Training for the VADs took an average of 6 weeks a course, 10 or 12 hours of lecture and demonstration. And that was 2 hours a week per course. So a lecture and then learning to bandage each other, having something demonstrated in the class by the doctor or the qualified retired nurse. It was either doctors or nurses were teaching the courses. So it was about 24 hours of study overall with an exam at the end. Now, St. John did not try to represent these newly minted VAD nursing members as equivalent to fully trained graduate nurses. The goal was instead to create a cohort of capable auxiliary nursing assistants armed with enough skill and the knowledge to be of use in a medical emergency. The VAD nurse really was envisaged as a kind of buffer against uninformed but well-meaning amateurs. She was trained to capably assist the military nurses, to be alert for warning signs, such as hemorrhaging, when more expert attention might be needed. She wasn't expected to take any independent initiative without instruction or guidance from a qualified nurse or a physician. Her role was only to assist, not to lead. Now, not surprisingly, the Canadian nursing community was not convinced. The VADs introduced a second level of nursing care, but Jean Gunn, who was then the president of the CNATN, recognized no middle ground between amateur and professional, although later in the war she did concede that experienced VADs could make ideal candidates as nursing probationers. She argued that the greater proportion of a nurse's preparation took place in the hospital wards, not in the classroom, where the students had direct contact with patients under the supervision of experienced teachers or senior students. But preparation for VAD work, even prior for those going abroad, offered very little opportunity for hospital training. Although qualified military nurses themselves at this time often had little more experience with the exceptional demands of wartime nursing, they could draw on their very rigorous instruction and the discipline and understanding of their 3 years of training and their background, which supported the demands of their work. But this lack of hands-on hospital experience was the greatest deficit in VAD preparation. And it did hamper many of them when they were actually overseas, but they had to learn on the job. They couldn't learn on the job in Canada, though, because the civilian hospitals did not want VADs in there, getting in the way of the regular nursing probationers. There was no place for them. So until they actually got some experience in the convalescent hospitals for the military, they really had little idea of what a hospital work contained. There were similar arguments against VAD assistant in the hospital, the local hospitals to start with, but they gradually overcame this and as the demand went up. And they began to use the VADs to help with routine things, housekeeping, basic nursing tasks, sort of freeing up the regular staff to do the real work of nursing. And by 1916, the VADs were regular workers in the local hospitals. It was just an accepted part of the wartime environment. Now, on the home front, the VADs were assigned to local facilities. And the work that they did there was very constant, often demanding, but constant, and far, far less stressful than it would have been if they'd been overseas, certainly a lot less physically exhausting. They seemed to work mostly during the day, not at night duties. In the local hospital, the work was really concentrated on healing persistent wounds, rehabilitation, post-operative care for all the men who were sent back for further treatment. One VAD, Shirley Gordon, was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto. And she started working in the local hospitals in the summer of 1918. She was first assigned to what was then called the Davisville Military Orthopedic Hospital. I'm not sure where that was in Toronto, because many of these buildings are gone. But, oops, I moved too far ahead. There we are. That's a very rare picture. It's very hard to get an interior picture, and you can tell it's a posed picture, obviously. Finding something that's just, spontaneous, well, it doesn't happen. And the woman in the front, of course, is a military nurse. She's not a VAD. If the VADs were around, they were probably in the background somewhere. But it just gives you a vague idea of what it was like there. She worked with soldiers who'd been invalided back to Toronto. They were doing, again, further surgery, rehabilitation. And very much like the routine work of regular nursing probationers, Gordon, in an interview that she had in the 1970s, said that she assisted with what she called top bandages, or just to hand things and wring out compresses so that they could accomplish more, meaning the nurses, than they could without that extra help. The work was always supervised, and it followed a very lengthy apprenticeship of far more menial tasks. The VADs sort of progressed up from cleaning the wards to preparing special diets for the patients, and then they finally graduated to bandages and dressings. And this apparently was the glamorous part of the work. VAD's shift at Davisville really denoted her experience and her expertise. The new VADs started on a 4-hour shift, and then they gradually worked up to an 8-hour shift, on the premise that they weren't used to this kind of work, and they would probably end up getting sick or whatever if they had to do too much too soon. All their work was very closely monitored by the nurses. Now, Gordon herself enjoyed a very congenial relationship with most of her supervisors at Davisville. She did mention a few who were, in her words, somewhat resentful, and she thought possibly they were worried that the VADs were there to take their jobs. But they were the exceptions and not the rule. From hindsight of several decades, and she was, I think, in her 80s when she was interviewed, Gordon considered that in 1918 the VADs were doing the same kind of work as what she would have called ward aides or nursing assistants are doing now, and that their efforts were actually appreciated. They felt appreciated. In her view, these are her words, the volunteers were a necessity. There were not enough nurses and trained people to do the job. Now, the VADs worked under the direct supervision of a nurse in charge, except in the kitchens. There they worked under an orderly sergeant. They were expected to maintain a respectful separation from the nursing personnel, lunching in the sergeant's mess, not with the commissioned nurses in the officer's mess. But as Shirley Gordon said, that was on paper. In reality, it was much more relaxed. While she was assigned to dressings, she lunched in the officer's mess with her supervising nurse, and just she was a really nice person. So another VAD, Bessie Hall, I had her up before. She also found the Canadian nurses very friendly and welcoming. She went into the Halifax VAD program in late 1918 after graduating from Dalhousie. I think I must keep bumping the buttons here without actually trying to go back. Getting a preview. Where'd I go? All right, wrong way. It's backwards to my own at home. There we are. There's Bessie. Okay, I'm going to try and stay away from that button. And actually, she went into a civilian hospital. Now, remember, this is Halifax after the explosion. There is an unprecedented need for nursing care in Halifax. Not only is there a lot of civilian problems still there and people still needing hospital care, but of course it's a naval base. And so there's naval hospitals, military hospitals. All help was welcome. So they started her off fairly easily in a children's ward in the Victoria General there. And she was sort of felt excited, but at the same time a little sort of intimidated. She said she tried to, she was assigned to taking pulses and taking temperatures and trying to look very wise so these little 5- and 6-year-old children wouldn't know how inexperienced she was. And she described her work as steady, but it wasn't taxing. There was no friction or conflict with the nursing staff. They seemed to be glad of the help. She described her own ward nurse as being particularly nice, and there was a great amount of camaraderie between the VADs and the nursing staff. They'd lend them dresses for parties, socialize together in the restaurants, whatever in town, exchange invitations to visit after the war. It was a very social, comfortable atmosphere. Now, most of these limited accounts, and they are very limited because home-based VADs did not write letters home because they were living where they were. Bessie's a little different because Bessie was living away from her small town in Nova Scotia, so she was writing home to her mother. But there's very few diaries that seem to have been found for home-based VADs. I don't think I've even seen one. I've known of some in Britain, but not here. But all women were in demand as nurses during the influenza crisis, and this is when you really get a sort of sense of what the VADs were doing. Training for VAD work was an asset then. I mean, after all, they had more training than the average person, so that was at least helpful. Dorothy MacPhail, at 21, the daughter of Sir Andrew MacPhail, the pathologist, was assigned to assist the nurses in a local Montreal emergency hospital. In letters to her father, she declared herself to be extremely happy in her new VAD role. She said, "I got to love my work more and more, and all the nursing sisters are so good to me." Really, I often wonder, though, how much of the fact that her father was a very prominent member of the local medical community, how much that might have played into her being accepted into this situation, but it's impossible to know that. But as this relentless disease quickly overwhelmed the reserves, really having a willing and efficient VAD who was willing to listen to the instruction was really a bonus during this time. Now, elsewhere, completely inexperienced VADs could find themselves temporarily in charge of numerous flu patients without any nursing supervision. A Calgary teacher, Gertrude Murphy, was sent out to an emergency hospital in Drumheller, which was then a small mining town. All of Murphy's initial 20 patients were very young miners, mostly immigrants from Eastern or Southern Europe, so they didn't speak any English. Now, ironically, this was in the schoolhouse. Her own school had been closed, and it was converted into an emergency hospital. And before she arrived, there had been no women at all to help in this hospital, just the mine owner and his assistant. When she arrived, they sort of a sigh of relief, and they turned back to the work of taking convalescent patients back to the town or returning the dead or taking the dead to the morgue. She said, well, I'm only a VAD. I don't know what to do. And they scoffed at her fears of what she was going to do, and essentially turned to her and said, well, you're a woman, aren't you? So this solved all the problems. So at the outset, Gertrude Murphy was absolutely horrified. She found herself alone with nearly 24 critically ill men. There weren't any alternatives. There she was. So she set to work. She making beds, emptying bedpans, bathing hands, faces, feeding anyone who could take the soup that had been provided by a local restaurant. Finally, after a few days, 2 more VADs and a qualified nurse arrived. But as elsewhere, the nurse herself voiced absolutely no objections to Murphy's untrained status. She even praised the work that she'd done on her own, and she set her to special the 16 most critically ill, as this patient count was rising by the day, eventually up to 80 at its peak. So again, the value of competent nursing, a little bit of training was better than none, essentially, and they were welcomed at the time. There are other first-hand VAD accounts that attest to their essential work as nursing assistants during this crisis. The very young Amelia Earhart, and it is that Amelia Earhart, was among the many VADs who worked in the Toronto Military Convalescent Hospital during this crisis. She was one of very few VADs in the hospital who were entrusted with night duty. That didn't happen often. And she helped in what she said to ladle out medicine from buckets in overcrowded wards. I'm not sure what the medicine was, but now before the epidemic had started, Earhart had spent most of her time in the diet kitchens and later in the dispensary. She had a bit of chemistry, so they put her into the dispensary, although she joked that her knowledge of chemistry counted less than being able to be trusted with the medical supply of the whiskey. Now, during the crisis, again, it was, Earhart was there, so were countless others, and there was no argument about it. They were needed during that time. It was different, though, when you got overseas. It was a different atmosphere. The Canadian VADs experienced far more varied reactions to their presence than those who were working at home with the Canadian sisters. Jean Sears, another Toronto VAD from the university, began her work at the Davisville Hospital, just like Shirley Gordon, and then she moved on to London a few months later. And that was really interesting because she could see the differences in the two types of hospitals and the different nursing communities. And she found much greater friction between nurses and VADs in the English hospitals than she did in Toronto. She found that the British hospitals were organized on a much more rigidly traditional standards than those in Toronto, whereas what she said, there was not the discipline there was in England, not quite. So there was a veneer of discipline, but they weren't rigid about it. VADs from Newfoundland and Canada alike found the unaccustomed rigors of life in England difficult to comprehend and accept sometimes. It was a world apart for them, and realizing that most of these women had never even been in a hospital before they became a VAD. Alice Bray went to Birmingham Military Hospital from Ottawa, and she wrote that everything is done absolutely according to military rule. You get up by the bugle, meaning reveille. You go to bed by lights out. Never having internalized the ritualized responses and deference expected of probationers in Canada, Jean Sears again was really amazed by the imperious authority of the matron at the second London General Military Hospital. The matron and the senior sisters and hospital administrators all sat at elevated tables in the dining hall. The matron's entrance was always delayed for dramatic effect, and when she arrived, the VAD nearest the door scurried from her seat to hold the door open, and the VADs and nurses together rose up, proffered a little vow as she swept in. This was just this ritual that went on. Now, Sears and the other VADs in her peer group really accepted this without complaint. I mean, it really didn't affect them, as she said. That was part of the hierarchy. But she really found some of the ward sisters to be very strict. And there were a few, as she said, she couldn't bear, which inevitably led to confrontation. And I will repeat her words here. One of them was so rude to me one day that I just turned and sauced her back. I said, I haven't come 3,000 miles to work voluntarily to be spoken like that by anybody. Now, of course, she reported me to the matron, and I was up on the carpet, so that I was changed from that ward. Now, for their part, I think of the other way. The nurses were very likely extremely frustrated by the limited disciplinary options they had for VADs. They couldn't be penalized by rank. They couldn't be penalized by salary. Although, as Alice Bray did report, some did face outright dismissal. This was rare. She said in a letter to her mother, one of our girls is being sent away on Saturday. Absolutely no reason given, only that she is to go. Now, the matron did have the option of not renewing a VAD's contract at the end of the 6-month term, but it likely required an infraction more grievous than just poor work habits for such an extreme sanction as immediate dismissal when reliable nursing aid was at a premium. I did find when I was studying the personnel cards in the British Red Cross, the ones for the Canadians, here and there would be a red stamp at the bottom of the card that said private file. Now, the Red Cross were wonderful to me. Oops, I'm not supposed to do that. But I could not look in the private file. So I'm absolutely intrigued to know what this dismissal was about. But, there were a lot of things unsaid, unwritten, and you just have to surmise what might have been going on. Now, overseas, the VADs had to very quickly adapt to the unaccustomed hospital routines and procedures, as well as a much more strenuous physical and emotional demands of their work. And more critically, they also had to adapt to working alongside qualified British military nursing personnel, all of whom, regardless of their age or their seniority, were their superiors in the hospital hierarchy. Some of the VADs, however, did bring their own biased preconceptions of the British nursing class and culture. Sybil Johnson, who was here, oh, dear. Okay, it's obviously a very sensitive machine. She feared that her probationary training in British hospitals might be supervised by what she called a certain kind of Englishwoman who is infuriating, self-satisfied, and perfectly inhuman. Now, her own past experience as a schoolgirl in England might have prompted this. She was a little bit more upper middle class from St. John's, and she'd been to one of the finishing schools there. But she was also very much influenced by an experienced VAD that she met on her voyage over to England, who related horrific tales of the British nurses as being infuriatingly superior and positively rude and overbearing. And then the woman conceded, but most of them are not that bad. So there was these troubling, ambivalent images that put Sybil into a state of really nervous anticipation. And she confided in a letter home that it was quite useless to be against those in authority, though. It doesn't do to be too docile and weak, but then she rationalized, it's rather hard to strike a happy medium. Now, there was this ambivalence really never fully dissipated during the whole of Sybil's time. Oh, gosh. Oh, okay. During her 19 months of service, she admired the nurses' dedication and hard work, and she was critical of their seemingly gruff and impatient demeanor with both the VADs and the patients. And a month into her service, she wrote to her father, cheerfully declaring that on some of the wards, the sisters are pigs and the nurses are horrors, but mine are really quite nice and jolly. So you get this in her letters. It would come out, and it was marvelous stuff. Now, some of the Canadian and Newfoundland VADs also experienced an unanticipated discrimination due to their status as colonials. In her first post in Birmingham, Alice Bray came up against this. The matron made it clear to her she disliked this class. And of the 6 Canadian VADs who were there in her group, only a Welsh-born Annie Wynne Roberts from Toronto was re-signed at the end of that term. The others went on to different hospitals, but Annie stayed there. And there she is. Okay. In the matron's explanation, Wynne Roberts was at least British. Now, how much of this was class or cultural or on the bias on the part of the matron or just her general resentment of VAD intrusion into the nursing sphere, it's impossible to know. But this sin of colonialism was a common charge that was experienced by many of the Canadian and Newfoundland VADs, and as well as the servicemen. They experienced this in other contexts as well. Violet Wilson was posted to a convalescent hospital for amputees in London's Gifford House. Now, she was a very high-spirited young woman from Edmonton. She had an abundance of independent self-confidence, very strong-willed, self-assured, likely an anathema to that strict military nursing contingent that were in there. And they were accustomed to unquestioning deference to authority, and a clash of wills was pretty much inevitable. Violet characterized the English nursing sisters as antagonistic to all VADs, but said they went out of their way to be particularly nasty to the colonials. We had to take a good deal from them, but when it was announced that we were to get up half an hour earlier in the morning in order to take hot water to them in their bedrooms, I rebelled. I said I'd come to help wait on the men, not the nurses, and I said it very loudly. Told by matron that colonials, large case, amongst our other awful characteristics, had no sense of discipline, I was put on night duty as a punishment. Now, that really isn't a major punishment, but that was where it was. But not all the Canadian and Newfoundland VADs suffered under this colonial sort of status at the time. Just adapting, though, was very difficult. The pace of work was less fevered in England than in France, but just as physically demanding. During her first month of work, you found Fanny Cluett, who was from Newfoundland. She rose at 6 a.m. with a half hour for breakfast, walked a mile to the hospital, and then she was on duty at 7. She began her day, and I'll just go through this litany of stuff. She scrubbed tables, sorted laundry, washed towels, swept, dusted, prepared for hand washing, ensured the wards were spotless before mid-morning milk breaks. Then she prepared for dressings, erecting screens around the patients, readying the fomentations, sterilized all the instruments, cleared it all away once the dressings were done, and then ready for midday dinners and feeding the patients. And then she had her own dinner break, and then she was back to washing, making beds, serving tea. And then it just went on. All of this went on continuously till 8 o'clock. None of this is difficult work, but it's constant, ongoing work. And then she had to walk a mile back to the hostel. Now, as she described it in her own singular style with her marvelous accent, we didn't stop hardly to draw a breath. And it was doubly demanding on the days when she lacked an assistant and had to do the work for two. Sybil Johnson had a similar routine. At the First Western General in Liverpool, she began more congenial hour of 8:15. This isn't her hospital, but it's an interior of many similar hospitals. They were adapted from stately homes, whatever building was available. So it wasn't like navigating a standard hospital. It just wasn't set up. So it probably made it harder work for everybody involved as well. But the cleaning and the sweeping, the dusting and the keeping patients washed, they were very little different from what Cluett was describing. She took temperatures, pulses. The physical work was lifting the men into the bath chairs to get them ready for walks outside, but it was far away from her own background of a comfortable middle-class life in St. John's. She enjoyed the work. She was very motherly. She found this was the kind of work she enjoyed, but at the same time, it wasn't the glamour that the recruitment posters projected in elevating VAD service to a spiritual calling. And I'm sure many of you have seen this poster before. It's a lot to live up to. The VADs had to adapt very quickly, follow directions to the letter, be responsible for their work, and complete all of their tasks without question. Now, across the Channel, in France and elsewhere, those hospitals closest to the front had even more pressure on their daily work. Here, the nursing sisters really cared only that the VA did her job without complaint and helped to make the work easier for everybody else. One woman I'd love to have done a screen capture for this. She was recorded in her probably late 80s, early 90s. Doreen Gary, lovely soft voice. She was from Montreal. She described how she met her very first task when she arrived in France. The patient had been bayoneted right down through his abdomen. He was dying, obviously. But her job was to take 2 gauze pads, pat down the intestines as they rose up while he was breathing, because it impaired his breathing. Well, I mean, this is a young woman who's never been in a hospital before, and her reaction was, I can't do it. I'd rather die than do it. And so the very tired nurse turned around and said to her, okay, Die then. You're of absolutely no use to me. Now, as Gary describes it, this was really like a splash of cold water. It sort of woke her up. And she was determined that she was going to meet this challenge. And so she worked away, did the job, did other jobs, and a few weeks later the same nurse came by, patted her quietly on the back, and sort of told her essentially that now she was being useful. She was meeting their needs, and that made her feel wonderful. Now, many of the VADs, like Doreen, were conscious of their lack of preparation for these unexpected challenges, and they dreaded the scorn or impatience of their harried supervisors, who were much more accustomed to responsive subservience. In September of 1915, Marjorie Starr from Montreal was the only Canadian VAD in the independent Scottish Women's Hospital that was established in the Abbaye de Royaumont in France, near Amiens. And this is an interior shot. The woman in the middle with the mob cap is actually the VAD. The Scottish organization had a different way of dressing their VADs to separate them from the nurses. I had 15 beds to make myself, a perfect stream of bedpans, 3 horrid dressings to prepare, bandage up, clear away. Then the other sister came back, and if she didn't set me to scrub lockers, and I jolly well had to smile and do it. So there was very little difference. English or Scottish, the demands were still the same, and the nursing response was still the same. Now, Starr, as a person, was far less resilient than others like Clewett or Doreen Geary. She suffered bouts of insomnia and the stress of watching the men suffer and die. But at Royaumont, the men generally came directly from the trenches, often in great numbers, in very grave condition. And there was often a great inrush of patients all at once. They were sort of overwhelmed. She did very well, though. When she was dealing with the patients specifically and had to experience their suffering, she felt it badly. But she could disassociate herself from that in other situations, and she was very good in the operating theater. She managed not to pass out, not to get sick, and she was interested in watching what the surgeons did. And so they often called her in to help out with surgeries. She talked about the very unorthodox things that they did there as well. Things didn't bother her, like at the dressing of the 2 amputated arms. Not nearly as bad as I thought it would be. Not like the man's leg, when I positively had to sit on his chest to keep him down while the doctor dressed it. And she sympathized with the poor VAD who yesterday got a leg to burn. So these sort of things went on. She said it didn't worry her being in the operating theater, although she'd find standing in the hot air holding up a man's leg for an hour could be a bit trying. But other than that, it wasn't a problem. It was interesting how she could separate one from the other. Starr and Johnson confided their frustrations with the nurses to their diaries because obviously public confrontation wasn't on. Sybil Johnson was the one who reacted most to being taken to task for anything. She was ticked off for arriving late to breakfast one day after a couple of weeks of night duty. And she really believed this sister wasn't pitching in, helping her, doing her share. And she complained that she had so much work to do, foments to change, 2 of which are 4 hourly. I could go on about all of this. The temperature. She talked about the endless jobs, but she'd get very frustrated with this fact. She didn't question the need for the painstaking tasks, only the lack of time and assistance. And she also liked a little bit of praise along the way, which they didn't have time to give or they didn't feel necessary. This was their job. This was their work. She wasn't really able to deal with what she saw as unreasonable expectations because she didn't have the background, the training to deal with that. The nurses, though, the VADs and nurses closer to the war zones, had much less friction between them. They were in a different situation. The nurses themselves were distanced from the oversight of the more senior generation of British nursing administrators. The women selected for transfer to the war zones were less constrained by the traditions of the hospital organization, and they were also working under conditions that frequently demanded a rapid adjustment to changing circumstances. Their weeks of comfortable routine could suddenly erupt, and they'd have hundreds and hundreds of men coming in at once, and they'd be up day and night at a time for a week or more. And in this environment, cooperation was absolutely critical. The nurses, the VADs, and the medical personnel all had to work together as efficiently as possible. It didn't do to be complaining or upset or sticking to rules of bowing and scraping when a matron would come in. during the calmer periods as well, when they were in France, Fanny Clewett talked about socializing with the nurses themselves. They'd go out for free afternoons together, walk in the parks, have coffee together in a local hotel, just relax together. It was a very convivial, very congenial way. It was a different atmosphere under this situation. They also got together, they helped at Christmas time, they decorate the wards. The ward sister would go and buy special things in the canteen for the men's Christmas tea. Now, Lynn MacDonald characterized the happy-go-lucky atmosphere of the hospitals in France. I think that's somewhat optimistic. I doubt it was quite like that. But the accounts of the Canadians and the Newfoundlanders do present a much more relaxed relationship between the nurses and the VADs who were there. I'm going to have to stop. They also stayed very aware of their minimal training. They realized that they were not the experts in this situation. The one nurse, when she was questioned by a patient because she was crying because he was in pain, and she was very soft-hearted, and he said, "I didn't know nurses wept." She said, "I'm not a nurse, I'm only a sham one." And she really felt that very closely. Her sister, Sybil, this was Jill Johnson. Sybil Johnson was much more defensive, though. She felt she needed a lot more bolstering and recognition for her work. My sisters are very nice, though the one in charge rather oppressively acts up to her idea of a superwoman among imbeciles, and she felt this all the way through. She found that she could be happy if things were going along smoothly and she was being recognized, but she was very judgmental in all of this. Now, I've got lots more, but I think Gertrude would like me to stop, so I'm going to stop doing that. All through this time, the nurses and the VADs had to work together, and especially in France, it was absolutely critical that they work together. And I'm just going to skip to the end here. Whether they worked in the hospitals, at home, or overseas, the VADs had to adapt to the realities of their service. For most, their brief VAD training was scant preparation for the actual sights, sounds, and smells of the war hospitals. Now, some, like Marjorie Starr, were overwhelmed often by the suffering, unable to endure more than a few months. She lasted 6 months, and that was it. The more stalwart, like Fanny Clewett, who managed to stay overseas for 4 years, were very pragmatic, very tolerant. She could laugh at herself when things went wrong, and she didn't get upset. But whatever their situation, they really realized that the whole idea of the angel of mercy was a romantic illusion, and it was a propagandist idea, but not reality. If she didn't reach this conclusion on her own, her hard-working, overburdened nursing supervisors soon made it clear. They were charged with training untried novices, demonstrated none of the discipline ingrained through a nursing probationer's experience. The sisters ranged from sympathetic to severe in their response to their VAD assistants, and some were more skeptical of these amateurs whose obvious failings were compounded by their colonial origins. Now, in the war zones, the nurses had very little time to contemplate whether a VAD was a political challenge to their professional status or future job security. And the VADs and nurses learned to negotiate the bedside for the benefit of the men they cared for. And the military nurses at home and overseas were frequently glad of these extra hands, helping them keep pace with the workload, and each, with their own uncertainties and their frustrations in an unprecedented time of crisis, found a way to work together for the benefit of the men under their care. Thank you. I'll skip through a lot of that.